The imposing chamber of the House Oversight Committee gleamed under the bright lights as cameras captured every moment of the high-profile hearing. Steve Bannon, the political strategist and media executive, sat confidently at the witness table, having spent the morning delivering pointed criticisms of proposed media regulations with his characteristic combative style. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a former defense attorney now serving her second term in Congress, was recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning. The room settled as she organized her documents, her expression composed and focused. "Mr. Bannon," she began, her voice measured and clear, "I've listened carefully to your testimony today regarding First Amendment protections and media oversight." What appeared to be routine questioning suddenly shifted as Crockett displayed a document on the large screens surrounding the chamber. "This is the full text of Supreme Court decision in Red Lion Broadcasting v. FCC," she continued. "I'd like to direct your attention to Justice White's majority opinion, particularly his analysis of the balance between public interest and media rights." Bannon leaned forward, squinting slightly at the text as Crockett methodically walked through a constitutional argument that connected 3 separate Supreme Court precedents with surgical precision. As she completed her legal analysis, she posed a question that cut to the heart of the day's testimony. The room fell completely silent as Bannon, known for his quick retorts, sat momentarily speechless. For perhaps the first time in his public career, the skilled media strategist appeared genuinely stunned by the constitutional framework Crockett had constructed. The cameras caught his expression of grudging respect as he gathered his thoughts. What happened next wasn't just an unexpected exchange. It was a moment that would redefine how Americans understood constitutional debates about media and democracy. If you value thoughtful dialogue that elevates our public discourse, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that highlights substantive engagement across political differences. To understand why this exchange between Representative Crockett and Steve Bannon resonated so powerfully, we need to examine their backgrounds and the complex issue at the center of the hearing. Steve Bannon had built his reputation as a formidable political and media strategist over decades. After serving as a naval officer and investment banker, he transitioned to media production and eventually became executive chairman of Breitbart News. His media experience and political influence made him a powerful voice in debates about press freedom and regulation. Bannon approaches these hearings with extraordinary confidence, noted media analyst Dr. Rebecca Palmer. He combines deep knowledge of constitutional law with an aggressive rhetorical style that often overwhelms questioning from legislators. Indeed, earlier that morning, Bannon had effectively parried questions from several committee members, using his extensive media experience to control the narrative. His testimonies were typically characterized by forceful arguments that left little room for follow-up, often citing constitutional precedents to bolster his positions. Representative Jasmine Crockett had followed a very different path to the hearing room. After graduating with honors from the University of Houston Law Center, she built her reputation as a civil rights attorney, often handling complex constitutional cases. Her transition to politics came after a decade of courtroom experience, where she developed a reputation for methodical legal reasoning and careful preparation. "What distinguishes Representative Crockett from many of her colleagues," explained legal correspondent James Mitchell, "is her substantive litigation background. She approaches these hearings like a seasoned trial attorney rather than a politician seeking sound bites." The issue at the heart of the hearing, the Digital Media Responsibility Act, touched on fundamental questions about the intersection of First Amendment protections and modern media challenges. The proposed legislation sought to establish new transparency requirements for digital media companies while creating mechanisms to address demonstrably false information that threatened public health or safety. Supporters argued the bill carefully balanced free speech protections with necessary guardrails for the digital age. Critics, including Bannon, maintained that any government role in media oversight represented a dangerous constitutional overreach. The morning's testimony had been contentious, with sharp exchanges between committee members and witnesses. Several representatives had attempted to challenge Bannon's constitutional arguments, but struggled to match his command of media law and Supreme Court precedents. The challenge in questioning someone like Bannon, noted constitutional scholar Dr. Michael Thompson, is that he genuinely understands First Amendment jurisprudence. Effective engagement requires equal knowledge and careful preparation. This was precisely the preparation Crockett had undertaken. In the weeks before the hearing, she had consulted with constitutional law professors and former FCC commissioners from both Republican and Democratic administrations. Rather than approaching the issue as a partisan battle, she had immersed herself in the legal nuances that transcended political divisions. "What's fascinating about media regulation from a constitutional perspective," Crockett had explained to her staff, "is that it's not cleanly aligned with left-right divisions. The Supreme Court has recognized both the essential nature of press freedom and the government's limited role in ensuring diverse voices can be heard. This nuanced understanding would prove crucial in the exchange that was about to unfold. We'd appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments on other examples of substantive dialogue that moved beyond partisan talking points to address complex constitutional questions. Your examples help us identify more stories worth sharing." The House Oversight Committee hearing room hummed with tension as the chairman recognized Representative Crockett for her 5 minutes of questioning. The previous 2 hours had established a predictable pattern. Committee members would attempt to challenge Bannon's position, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by his aggressive rhetoric and rapid-fire citations of free speech principles. Crockett took a different approach from the outset. Rather than launching immediately into questions, she began by establishing common ground. "Mr. Bannon, I think we can agree that the First Amendment's protections for press freedom represent a cornerstone of American democracy," she began. Bannon nodded slightly, his posture indicating he was prepared for another round of the same arguments he had successfully deflected all morning. "And I believe we also agree that Supreme Court precedent should guide our understanding of constitutional boundaries in media regulation," Crockett continued. "Absolutely, Congresswoman," Bannon replied, his voice confident. "The court has consistently emphasized minimal government involvement in press functions." Crockett nodded, acknowledging his point rather than immediately contradicting it. "That's a crucial principle. Now, I'd like to explore how the court has understood that principle across different technological eras." She activated the display screens around the chamber, showing a timeline of major Supreme Court decisions regarding media and the First Amendment. In 1969, the Supreme Court decided Red Lion Broadcasting v. FCC, Crockett began, highlighting the case on the timeline. "Are you familiar with Justice White's majority opinion in that case, Mr. Bannon?" Bannon leaned forward slightly, clearly recognizing the shift to substantive legal analysis. "Of course. Red Lion upheld the now-defunct fairness doctrine, but it's widely considered outdated given the technological changes since then." Crockett nodded. "Let's look at Justice White's specific reasoning, though." She displayed the text of the decision on the screens. Justice White wrote, and I quote, "It is the right of the viewers and listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount." He further explained that this principle derived from the scarcity of broadcast frequencies. She paused, allowing the quotation to register. "Mr. Bannon, would you agree that White's analysis hinged on the technological limitations of broadcasting at that time?" Bannon nodded. Yes, the scarcity rationale was central to Red Lion, but later decisions like Reno v. ACLU rejected applying broadcast standards to the Internet precisely because scarcity doesn't apply to digital media. Several committee members looked surprised at the substantive legal exchange unfolding, a stark contrast to the political talking points that had dominated earlier questioning. Crockett continued, "You're right that Reno rejected direct application of broadcast standards to the Internet. Let me display Justice Stevens' opinion from that 1997 case." The screens changed to show the Reno decision, with key passages highlighted. Justice Stevens wrote that the Internet had not historically received the same level of First Amendment protection as print media, but deserved full protection in part because, unlike broadcasting, the Internet can hardly be considered a scarce expressive commodity. Crockett paused, allowing the quotation to register before continuing. "Now, I'd like to move forward to a more recent case, Knight First Amendment Institute versus Trump from 2019. The timeline advanced, highlighting the case that addressed whether a public official could block users on social media. The Second Circuit held that President Trump's Twitter account constituted a public forum, and blocking users based on their views violated the First Amendment. What's significant here is the court's recognition that digital platforms can function as public forums despite being privately owned. Bannon shifted in his seat, clearly engaged with this substantive analysis. Congresswoman, Knight addressed government officials using private platforms, not regulation of the platforms themselves. The distinction is crucial. Crockett nodded, acknowledging his point. That's precisely what I want to explore. Let me display one more case, Pruneyard Shopping Center versus Robbins from 1980. The timeline shifted again, highlighting a case many in the room seemed unfamiliar with. In Pruneyard, the Supreme Court upheld a California requirement that privately owned shopping malls allow individuals to exercise free speech rights on their property. Justice Rehnquist wrote that states could ensure broader access rights than the First Amendment minimally required, so long as the property's primary use wasn't unduly impaired. She paused, allowing the committee to process this information before making her central point. Mr. Bannon, what emerges across these cases isn't a simple rule against government involvement in media, but rather a nuanced framework that balances multiple constitutional values, speaker rights, listener rights, and public forum principles, with analysis that evolves as technology changes. The room grew quiet as committee members and audience alike recognized they were witnessing a substantive constitutional discussion rather than the typical political theater. Crockett displayed a diagram showing the interconnections between the cases she had cited, revealing a complex but coherent constitutional framework. The Digital Media Responsibility Act doesn't impose content restrictions like the old fairness doctrine. Instead, it creates transparency requirements and narrow remedies for demonstrably false information that threatens public safety, more like securities disclosure laws than content regulation. She turned directly to Bannon. My question is this: given the Supreme Court's recognition in Red Lion that listener rights are paramount, the recognition in Knight that digital spaces can function as public forums, and the acknowledgement in Pruneyard that private property rights aren't absolute when serving public functions, isn't the proper constitutional analysis more complex than simply asserting that any government role in media oversight violates the First Amendment? The room fell completely silent as Bannon, known for his quick responses, paused to consider the intricate constitutional framework Crockett had constructed. For perhaps the first time that day, the skilled media strategist seemed genuinely caught off guard by the depth and precision of the analysis. After several seconds that felt much longer in the tense hearing room, Bannon leaned toward his microphone. "Congresswoman, you've presented a sophisticated constitutional argument," he began, his tone notably different from his earlier combative responses. "While I maintain that the First Amendment creates a presumption against government regulation of media, you're correct that the court has recognized competing values in specific contexts." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I would suggest, however, that even within the framework you've outlined, any legislation must be narrowly tailored to address specific harms without chilling protected speech." Rather than claiming outright victory, Crockett nodded respectfully. "That's precisely the balance we're trying to achieve, Mr. Bannon. The transparency provisions are modeled after securities disclosure requirements, which the court has repeatedly upheld despite their impact on commercial speech." For the remainder of her time, Crockett and Bannon engaged in a substantive dialogue about specific provisions of the proposed legislation, analyzing each through the constitutional framework she had established. The exchange was remarkable not for its confrontational nature, but for its depth and substantive focus on constitutional principles rather than political positioning. As Crockett's time expired, committee members on both sides of the aisle appeared struck by the contrast between this exchange and the political theater that typically characterized such hearings. As Representative Crockett's questioning time concluded, the committee chairman thanked her and prepared to recognize the next member. Before he could proceed, however, Bannon raised his hand slightly. "Mr. Chairman, if I might respond more fully to the Congresswoman's analysis," he requested, an unusual break in protocol that indicated his engagement with the substantive arguments Crockett had presented. The chairman, sensing the significance of the moment, nodded his assent. "Representative Crockett," Bannon began, his tone markedly different from his earlier testimonies, "you've presented one of the most thoughtful constitutional frameworks I've encountered in these hearings." The room remained silent as attendees recognized they were witnessing something rare in contemporary political discourse, a moment of genuine intellectual engagement across ideological lines. While I maintain significant reservations about the legislation, Bannon continued, your analysis correctly identifies the complex balancing of constitutional values the Supreme Court has engaged in across different technological eras. He leaned forward slightly, his expression reflecting professional respect rather than political positioning. Your connection of Red Lion, Pruneyard, and Knight creates a coherent framework for analyzing these questions. It's precisely the kind of substantive legal reasoning that should inform these discussions, regardless of where one ultimately comes down on specific provisions. The cameras captured Crockett's measured nod of acknowledgement as Bannon continued. I would suggest, however, that your analysis might benefit from incorporating the court's skepticism of content-based restrictions in cases like Reed versus Town of Gilbert, which emphasized that seemingly neutral justifications can still create First Amendment concerns when they target specific content. Rather than becoming defensive, Crockett reached for her legal pad and made a note. That's an excellent point, Mr. Bannon. Reed does establish important guardrails for any regulation that might indirectly affect content. What followed was extraordinary by the standards of congressional hearings, a substantive, detailed exchange about constitutional principles that transcended the usual partisan divides. Bannon raised concerns about specific provisions of the legislation, but now framed them within Crockett's constitutional framework rather than dismissing the entire approach. Section 4(b) of the bill, he noted, requires platforms to create reasonable procedures for addressing demonstrably false information that threatens public safety. The vagueness of reasonable potentially grants too much discretion to regulators, raising concerns under the void for vagueness doctrine. Crockett considered this point before responding. That's a legitimate concern. Would more specific procedural requirements, perhaps modeled after the notice and takedown framework in copyright law, address that constitutional issue? Bannon nodded thoughtfully. That would be an improvement, though I'd recommend incorporating a strong good faith provision similar to Section 230's protection for voluntary moderation. The chairman, recognizing the value of this exchange, allowed it to continue beyond the usual time constraints. Committee members, rather than appearing impatient, watched with evident interest as two individuals with different political perspectives engaged in substantive analysis of complex constitutional questions. What's happening here, whispered one senior legislative aide to a reporter, is what these hearings are supposed to be, actual deliberation about constitutional principles rather than political theater. As the exchange continued, Crockett addressed another of Bannon's concerns about the legislation's approach to algorithm transparency. You've raised important points about protecting proprietary information in algorithm disclosure requirements, she acknowledged. Would you see a constitutional distinction between requiring disclosure of general algorithmic principles versus specific code implementation? Bannon considered this thoughtfully. The distinction is meaningful. Disclosure of general principles that affect public discourse implicates less significant property interests than revealing specific code. Supreme Court precedent in cases like Zordera versus Office of Disciplinary Counsel supports disclosure requirements that provide factual, uncontroversial information. The exchange had transformed what began as typical congressional theater into something approaching an academic constitutional law seminar, but with real-world implications for legislation that would affect millions of Americans. As their discussion concluded, Bannon made a statement that stunned many in the hearing room. Representative Crockett, while I maintain reservations about specific provisions, your constitutional framework has persuaded me that some form of transparency, regulation can be consistent with First Amendment principles if properly tailored. I would welcome the opportunity to provide technical feedback on revisions that might address the constitutional concerns we've discussed. The offer of constructive engagement from a figure typically associated with hardline opposition to media regulation left the hearing room in momentary silence. It represented not just a personal acknowledgement of Crockett's legal acumen, but a rare public example of how substantive dialogue could move beyond entrenched positions. Crockett responded with equal professionalism. Mr. Bannon, I appreciate both your critique and your offer of technical input. The constitutional issues we're wrestling with transcend partisan divisions, and I believe we all benefit from rigorous analysis like you've provided today. As the chairman finally moved to recognize the next committee member, there was a palpable sense that something important had happened, a demonstration that even in deeply divided times, substantive engagement with constitutional principles could create unexpected common ground. The remainder of the hearing continued, but both committee members and spectators recognized that the exchange between Crockett and Bannon had fundamentally shifted the tenor of the proceedings from political posturing to substantive deliberation. A veteran Capitol Hill reporter was overheard remarking to a colleague, "In 20 years covering Congress, I've rarely seen someone build a constitutional argument that it actually changed the terms of debate in real time." The C-SPAN cameras captured the moment when Crockett, gathering her materials as another representative began questioning, received notes of congratulation from colleagues on both sides of the aisle, an acknowledgement that her approach had elevated the entire proceeding beyond partisan divisions to focus on the substantive constitutional questions at stake. In the days following the House Oversight Committee hearing, the exchange between Representative Crockett and Steve Bannon became the subject of extensive analysis and commentary, but not in the way typical political confrontations were covered. Instead of focusing on who won or lost, legal publications and constitutional scholars examined the substantive arguments and their implications for media regulation in the digital age. The Harvard Law Review published an analysis titled "Crockett-Bannon Exchange Reveals Evolving First Amendment Framework for Digital Media," which examined how the constitutional principles discussed during the hearing might apply to a range of emerging technologies. "What made the exchange remarkable," wrote Professor Eleanor Richardson, "wasn't just the depth of constitutional analysis, but how it demonstrated that thoughtful legal reasoning can transcend political positioning. Both Crockett and Bannon engaged with Supreme Court precedent in sophisticated ways that revealed the complex balancing required in this area." Law schools across the country incorporated videos of the exchange into constitutional law courses, using it as a model of how to construct and respond to nuanced legal arguments about evolving technological challenges. "I've been teaching First Amendment law for 15 years, noted Professor James Hernandez of Georgetown Law, and this exchange provides one of the clearest examples I've seen of how to connect disparate Supreme Court precedents into a coherent analytical framework that addresses new technological contexts. The impact extended beyond academic circles. In media coverage, commentators noted how the substantive nature of the exchange contrasted with the political theater that typically characterized congressional hearings. For a brief moment, wrote columnist Sarah Johnson, Americans glimpsed what democratic deliberation is supposed to look like: thoughtful engagement with complex constitutional questions rather than performative confrontation designed for social media clips. More significantly, the exchange influenced the legislative process itself. 2 weeks after the hearing, the House Judiciary Committee held a special working session on the Digital Media Responsibility Act that incorporated many of the constitutional concerns Bannon had raised within Crockett's framework. Representative Michael Richardson, a co-sponsor of the legislation, acknowledged this influence during the markup session. The exchange between Representative Crockett and Mr. Bannon identified specific provisions that needed refinement to better align with First Amendment principles. The revised language in Sections 4 and 7 directly responds to those constitutional concerns. The revised bill included more precise definitions of demonstrably false information, stronger procedural protections for content creators, and clearer distinctions between transparency requirements and content regulation. These changes earned the legislation support from some lawmakers who had previously opposed it on constitutional grounds. Senator Elizabeth Warner, who had initially expressed skepticism about the bill, noted the improvements. The revised approach demonstrates how substantive constitutional dialogue can produce better legislation. By addressing legitimate First Amendment concerns within a coherent framework, the bill now balances free expression with necessary transparency in ways consistent with Supreme Court precedent. Perhaps most surprisingly, Bannon himself acknowledged the improvements in a media appearance 3 months after the hearing. "I maintain concerns about government involvement in media regulation," he noted during an interview. "But I must acknowledge that Representative Crockett's constitutional framework, as reflected in the revised legislation, represents a good faith attempt to address legitimate public concerns while respecting First Amendment principles." He added, with a hint of his characteristic directness, "I'm still not entirely convinced, but I respect the serious engagement with constitutional principles the revisions reflect." 6 months after the hearing, when the modified legislation passed the House with bipartisan support, many observers credited the Crockett-Bannon exchange with establishing the constitutional framework that made that outcome possible. "What began as a typical confrontational hearing," noted constitutional scholar Robert Chen, evolved into a model of how substantive legal reasoning can bridge ideological divides on complex constitutional questions. The legislation's journey through the Senate followed a similar pattern, with the Judiciary Committee explicitly referencing the constitutional framework established in the House hearing as they considered amendments and refinements. Law schools began incorporating the full legislative history, centered on the Crockett-Bannon exchange, into courses on legislation and statutory interpretation, highlighting how substantive constitutional dialogue could improve legislative outcomes. This case study demonstrates that when lawmakers engage seriously with constitutional principles, they can craft legislation that navigates complex First Amendment terrain more effectively, explained Professor Maria Rodriguez in a widely shared article on the legislative process. 1 year after the hearing, the Annenberg Public Policy Center conducted a study examining its impact on public understanding of constitutional principles. The results were striking. Americans who had watched the exchange demonstrated significantly greater understanding of First Amendment principles and their application to digital media than those who had only seen traditional news coverage of the issue. The substantive nature of the discussion, the researchers concluded, provided viewers with a framework for understanding the constitutional values at stake, rather than simply reinforcing existing political positions. At a judicial conference marking the first anniversary of the legislation's passage, a panel of federal judges from across the ideological spectrum examined how courts were interpreting its provisions in light of First Amendment principles. Judge William Harrison, appointed by a Republican president, observed, "The legislative history, particularly the exchange that established the constitutional framework, provides unusually clear guidance for balancing the competing values at stake. This clarity has made judicial review more consistent across different circuits." Judge Elena Rodriguez, appointed by a Democratic president, agreed, "When legislation reflects serious engagement with constitutional principles, as this clearly does, courts can apply it with greater confidence that we're respecting both legislative intent and constitutional boundaries." As constitutional law continues to evolve in response to technological change, the exchange between Representative Crockett and Steve Bannon stands as an example of how substantive engagement with legal principles can produce better outcomes than political positioning. In a media landscape often dominated by conflict and division, their dialogue demonstrated that even individuals with different political perspectives can find common ground through rigorous analysis of shared constitutional principles. The lesson here, noted legal philosopher Dr. James Chen, isn't that constitutional analysis eliminates disagreement, but rather that it provides a framework for productive disagreement, one focused on principles rather than personalities, and on substance rather than spectacle. For educators, lawmakers, and citizens concerned about the quality of public discourse, the Crockett-Bannon exchange offers a model of engagement worthy of emulation, a reminder that the most productive conversations often begin not with assertions of position, but with genuine exploration of underlying principles. If you found value in this examination of substantive constitutional dialogue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. In a media environment often dominated by political conflict, we remain committed to highlighting examples of thoughtful engagement with fundamental principles that transcend partisan divisions. America's constitutional challenges will continue to evolve with changing technology and social conditions. The Crockett-Bannon exchange reminds us that addressing these challenges effectively requires not just advocacy for particular positions, but the kind of rigorous analysis and good faith engagement that can build bridges across ideological divides. In your own discussions of complex public issues, consider how you might apply the lessons from this remarkable exchange, focusing on principles rather than positions, seeking to understand rather than to defeat, and recognizing that even those with whom we deeply disagree may offer insights that improve our own thinking.